Do you think they'll resort to poison or some other trick?
Enkrid asked as soon as dawn broke the next morning. Jackson heard the question and shook his head. Now he was back to his usual self, indifferent, bored, with a calm expression and demeanor. Only his tone revealed a faint hint of malice.
They won't do the same thing again.
Jackson's voice as he uttered those words was like an ice shard pulled from a glacier, cold, laced with sarcasm toward those who had dared to meddle while he was away. Of course, the cold and murderous smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He returned to his usual aloof and proud expression, one that wouldn't flinch even if pricked by a needle.
You mean to make sure they won't?
Enkrid asked, and Jackson gave a nonchalant nod. That was enough. As he said, nothing significant happened throughout the day. The ones who had come forward as a warning didn't reappear. They wouldn't come back in a single day, would they? No. Even if 2 or 3 days passed, they probably wouldn't return. If they had come when he was alone, they certainly wouldn't come when they were all together. Enkrid spent another day. He trained mindlessly, focusing on his practice, and put Andrew and the 5 trainees through the ringer.
Spare me!
One of the trainees muttered under his breath without realizing it.
Yes, today's single sword strike will save you tomorrow.
Enkrid responded earnestly to the trainee's lament, earning applause from Dunbachel.
A wise saying. It's not wisdom, it's a declaration that I won't listen to that nonsense, you idiot beast.
Rem mocked from the side. Their conversation was only faintly audible to Enkrid. The trainees couldn't hear it. Rem likely lowered his voice deliberately, knowing why Enkrid gave such a reply. To be begging for mercy at this level?
I can push them even harder.
Enkrid wanted the trainees to pour all their energy into their sword practice, sparing none for words. Beyond simply fulfilling their desires and ambitions, he intended to ensure they wouldn't die if possible. In Enkrid's eyes, the Gardner family's forces amounted to no more than 7, Andrew, Mac, and the 5 trainees. Of them, Andrew was the only one somewhat useful.
Useful only in a situation like this, though.
If things went wrong, they'd all just die. He knew them, so he had no desire to stand by and watch Andrew die. That said, he couldn't follow them around, protecting them constantly. The best solution was for them to learn how to protect themselves. That was the purpose of this training, so pushing them harder was the right approach. At times like this, it was better to act like a wall that couldn't understand, rather than listen and scold. When people think they can communicate, they attempt conversation. But with someone they can't communicate with, they don't even try. They just focus on doing what needs to be done. That's what Enkrid wanted. He wanted them to become so absorbed in their task that they struggled as if their lives depended on it. Having risen from the bottom, he knew what kind of mindset they needed right now.
Ugh.
The trainee groaned in despair, and Enkrid was pleased. Ragnar nodded as he watched. He gave his all in everything. Just like the commander he knew, it was satisfying. Seeing that, his own motivation surged again.
The sword.
Ragnar quickly drifted into his own world. Jackson remained silent as he observed the same scene. Over the past 2 days, the only words he had spoken were to say that the enemy wouldn't resort to the same tricks again. No one approached him for conversation either. Even Andrew found Jackson intimidating. Mac, of course, wasn't someone who would speak to him. The 5 trainees were too busy trying to survive on their own. Rem and Ragnar also had no reason to provoke him. Everyone had their tasks at hand. Sometimes, when Enkrid stepped away, Rem would fill in for him.
If you hit me even once, you get a break.
He was showing the 5 trainees a new kind of hell, and Rem thoroughly enjoyed it. Meanwhile, Ragnar was off to the side, swinging his sword and lost in thought. Occasionally, he would mutter to himself, light, fast, and heavy, revealing that he was deeply pondering his swordsmanship. Amid all this, Jackson remained silent, lost in his own thoughts. At first, he focused on his own situation.
Is this a game of cat and mouse?
With the evidence he had so far, he had identified his target for revenge. But identifying a target doesn't mean it can be easily found. It was difficult. He needed to gather more information, dig deeper. After those practical considerations, a more fundamental question arose.
Is this the right path?
The path he had chosen wasn't one that would lead to help. What is the right path? What is the answer? Why had he spent his entire life consumed by vengeance? If revenge is his goal, is this really the way to go about it?
Strike.
Enkrid's words echoed in his mind. Jackson looked over and saw Enkrid with his arm wrapped in bandages. The days were growing warmer, so sleeves were getting shorter. The wound hadn't been treated properly, more like neglected, but it hadn't become infected and was healing well. It was a mark made by Jackson's own stiletto.
Why are you worrying? Start by figuring out why. Think about the why.
His master had said that to him. Jackson had followed that advice. The reason for worry lies in the heart. It happens because the heart can't find its direction. If you don't understand, you're dragged along. But if you do, you're not. Finding the why doesn't mean you need to find an answer. There are many paths. Jackson had chosen one of them. Instead of trying to control his emotions, he let them run wild. Instead of worrying, is this the right thing to do? He simply acted. He just did it. He moved. He acted. He took steps toward the result. It was Enkrid's mindset. Jackson had learned from watching him. Suddenly, he glimpsed the greatness of the man before him.
He doesn't give up just because he lacks talent.
Instead of worrying, he strategizes. When his mind can't solve a problem, he uses his body, and while using his body, he still thinks. He does whatever it takes. It's a struggle.
You can't do it. Not with skills like that.
He wasn't shaken by the criticism and ridicule exchanged around him. He moved forward undeterred. The complexity in Jackson's heart was soon replaced by simplicity. The tangled threads unraveled and straightened out. In other words, he decided to act according to his heart for now. Afterward, Rem, bored, continued to torment the 5 trainees. Dunbachel took 2 curved swords from Enkrid and practiced swinging them, determined to get used to them. Later, she even transformed into her beast form and requested a sparring match with Ragna, only to get beaten. Ragna spent his time swinging his sword or lying on the grass beside the training yard. He seemed idle unless someone challenged him to a duel. Jackson occasionally left the estate with Enkrid, but often ventured out alone. When the two went out together, it was usually to attend a party. Enkrid often took Andrew along as his escort. On rare occasions, they encountered people they knew. The capital was teeming with people, all vying for a position, so such meetings were bound to happen.
It's been a while.
The other person responded, and Enkrid spoke next. It was an old instructor who had taught swordsmanship when Enkrid was previously in the capital. Not the most honorable person.
So you're really that Enkrid.
The former instructor, who was known for talking nonsense, said. Back then he had judged Enkrid's skills as impressive. But how would he measure up now? Enkrid nodded, considering the thought.
Ridiculous.
The man muttered and whispered to his companions. From the bits Enkrid overheard, it seemed like they were calling him a fraud. He ignored them. Andrew's brow furrowed.
Shall we let this go?
Andrew was ready to step in at any moment.
Let it be.
Enkrid glanced at them, deciding there was no need to provoke a confrontation. The nonsense-talking instructor smirked at Enkrid, his smile reminiscent of a fishy odor, cunning and insincere.
Yeah, sure. See you around.
The former instructor, laughing with his companions, left. He wasn't even their leader. Was there anyone noteworthy among them? It didn't seem so. Enkrid ignored it. It was just a passing event. It was only after attending a few parties that Enkrid finally met Krang. Krang mentioned that it had been difficult to leave the palace.
Everyone's on the verge of drawing their swords at any moment.
Count Molson.
I don't know much about the inner workings of the palace. I just mentioned the most influential person I could think of.
It was a wrong guess. Krang smiled at this and responded.
In reality, the person currently holding the blade to the king's throat isn't a noble from the frontier, but someone within the palace.
Without even asking who, Krang continued speaking.
It's a man named Viscount Myrnes.
From what he explained, Myrnes had formed a faction within the palace, gathering power into one force. It seemed he was in competition with Viscount Vancento, and was cultivating ambitions separate from Count Molson.
He's a troublesome fellow, one of the 5 fingers.
As Krang spoke, he pressed his palm against the bench, stretched his back, and looked up at the sky. Despite the serious topic, he looked oddly at ease. The 5 fingers that upheld the palace referred to the 5 great families. There was the Marquis Vuissar from the Thumb family. The Lockhorn family, represented by the forefinger, had served in the military for generations. The middle finger referred to the ruler of the frontier, Count Molson. The ring finger was responsible for the kingdom's finances, currently managed by the person known as the Marquis of Octo. The last family, known as the Pinky, was in charge of guarding the palace. though their name remained unknown, and currently, none of the 5 families supported the queen. They were all too busy looking after their own interests. Krang didn't explain all of this in detail. There was no need to. He glanced at Enkrid, who didn't seem particularly interested in such matters. So what was Enkrid curious about that led him to seek out Krang? At first, the attention had been on Andrew, who had accompanied him to the party as an uninvited guest. But soon the gossip shifted to focus on his guard, the hero born from the border guard. A man whose reputation had been inflated by tales of grandeur. It was said that someone who knew Enkrid's past had been spreading stories non-stop. The rumors were that in reality he had poor skills and was someone who lived off the glory earned by his subordinates, reveling in an undeserved reputation.
Is it a case of not believing unless they see it for themselves?
Is that arrogance? Or perhaps conceit? Or are they simply trying to protect their own long-standing reputations?
It's probably all of those things.
Krang regarded them all as fools. If they didn't trust his reputation, they could pretend to be friendly and test him. And if that didn't suit them, it would be better to just observe him for a while. Yet a few foolish and ignorant nobles were busy belittling and criticizing Enkrid.
Are they simply lacking intelligence?
How could someone with such a small mind become a palace official? One of the people most eager to tear down Enkrid was the palace's security chief. He was the superior of all the heads of the guard and oversaw the entire palace security force.
Should I be happy about this?
Should he feel glad that a potential enemy was a fool, or should he lament that the palace he served was filled with incompetence? Or should he blame the queen for leading such a nation, or perhaps he should feel sympathy for the queen? After all, this mess wasn't entirely her doing. Of course, Enkrid's sudden rise in attention wasn't solely due to his skills.
I'd love to see that face for myself. Is he really that handsome? They say it's a feast for the eyes.
It was the curiosity of the noblewomen. Apparently, the 2 men accompanying Andrew as his guards had captivated the entire party. Naturally, those 2 were Enkrid and Jackson. This likely fueled the gossip and borderline slander directed at Enkrid by the envious noblemen. After all, throughout history, jealousy has always been one of the strongest motivators. In fact, some of the nobles were practically dying to kill Enkrid. That included the security chief. If Enkrid were to draw his sword in the city, wouldn't the guards be dispatched immediately? As Krang pondered this, he spoke.
Viscount Murnus is the son-in-law of Marquis of Vassar and comes from the Lockhorn family.
He's someone who has the most powerful backer in the current palace, and he's even brought in private soldiers to the capital. Some of the royal guard are under his command, too. Since entering the capital, he's rapidly expanded his influence, gathering surrounding factions into one force. In terms of danger, he's at least twice as dangerous as Count Molson in the current situation.
There are even rumors that he's gathered a battalion of private soldiers outside the capital. So, what are you curious about?
Krang paused mid-sentence to ask. He assumed there had to be a purpose for Enkrid's visit. Enkrid had many questions, but they all boiled down to one key point. One question that would clear up much of his uncertainty. So Enkrid asked about those he had expected and assumed should be present.
Where are all the knights?
If there was even a single knight in the palace, if they were by the queen's side, would someone like this Murnus or Murnos character be able to act so brazenly? Assassins had thrown out warnings in broad daylight. At night, the howls of beasts echoed, and every day new rumors and horror stories spread in the capital. If there were knights, if the night orders were active, such things couldn't and shouldn't be happening. That was the fundamental question that connected all these strange occurrences. Beside Krang, 5 steps away, a whip-wielding bodyguard stood on alert, keeping an eye on the surroundings. In addition, there was a bald warrior who looked like he could handle himself, standing with him. The warrior was behind Krang, showing his back like a statue. He had a well-trained body, easily recognizable at a glance. He wasn't some amateur. Enkrid looked at the 2 of them and thought of Andrew. He was probably making a grim face somewhere inside the party hall right now. When he attended parties, he often complained that people didn't even treat him like a ghoul. Meaning if he were a ghoul, at least they'd acknowledge him and give him dirty looks. But instead, they completely ignored him. A petty noble, a mere baron at that, who had made the wrong connections, who would bother dealing with him? Even the butler at the entrance of the party, completely ignored him.
Baron Andrew Gardner, you really came here.
The butler didn't even bother with formal language. Andrew sighed inwardly, but answered calmly on the surface.
Why? Am I not allowed here?
Your invitation.
You must have missed sending it. Busy, I assume.
You may enter.
The butler, with a deeply displeased expression, allowed Andrew inside. As for Enkrid, who was acting as a bodyguard, he wasn't allowed in. Actually, he had managed to slip inside a few times before. Thanks to that, he'd gained some attention and recognition. After that, though, the host stopped allowing bodyguards in. Not that Enkrid cared much about the inside of the party hall. He was here mainly to observe Krang and the general atmosphere. Truthfully, part of him had hoped that while wandering the night streets, he might encounter another warning fanatic, but nothing of the sort happened. In the end, he met Krang and asked him a question.
A knight.
Krang paused for a moment, deep in thought. His pupils didn't waver, and there wasn't a hint of tension. Only after carefully choosing his words did he continue.
Why is it that Count Molson, who claims to be the king of the frontier, hasn't been punished? That was the first question I had.
Krang had pondered it, and since he had already found the answer, he was able to provide it.
You know the southern kingdom of Rehenstetten, right?
Krang's tone was casual, as if he were introducing a well-known tavern at a market square. Though it was evening, it wasn't too cold, so having a conversation outdoors was perfectly pleasant. An old bench, the lights of a house where the party was in full swing. A few fireflies and other glowing insects could be seen. The conversation didn't quite match the peaceful surroundings, but Krang's voice, always cheerful, made it feel like a leisurely evening stroll, despite the subject matter.
It's already been 7 years since we've been fighting the kingdom of Rehenstetten, and we haven't been easily defeated, right?
That's true, he had heard rumors of that.
Do you know why?
Because the southern territories are fighting well.
For such good fighters, didn't they crumble a bit too easily when the monster uprising began?
And what's the reason?
Because Sir Cyprus and another knight are holding the line there.
The southern kingdom of Rehenstetten's military strength was objectively superior to Naurilia's. They had their own reasons for not achieving complete victory. But even so, the fact that they were being held back was remarkable. They resisted. They pushed back the invasion.
I went to see it for myself after hearing the news. Those two knights are performing what could only be described as miracles. If they were to falter, the southern front would fall by tomorrow.
As Krang spoke, he nudged a stone on the ground with his foot, then kicked it free from the earth. After pulling out the embedded stone, he kicked it around a bit and continued.
The two knights are tied down there. Do you think they're the only ones? Their entire knight order must be tied down too.
Enkrid wasn't a fool. What's the best way not to be pushed back on the battlefield? You reinforce your forces and bolster your strength. The kingdom did just that. 2 knights are currently defending the southern border. If even one of them had turned away from the border, they'd already be halfway ruined due to Rehenstetten's invasion. Krang knew how much of a mess this country was, and now Enkrid knew it too.
The third knight.
Naurilia had 3 knights, at least 3 that were known.
The third knight is currently facing off against a horde of monsters.
This was news to Enkrid. It was top-secret information, yet Krang maintained his casual tone.
Well, some troublesome monsters showed up and formed a colony. Plus, the mercenary king in the east has been eyeing this place, so part of the knight order had to be dispatched there, and they aren't the only threat.
Even during the full-scale war with Aspen, 1 knight barely managed to pull away to join the battlefield. Back then, the focus of the battle wasn't on wearing down Aspen's forces. Instead, the focus was on striking quickly and withdrawing just as fast. Why?
Because they couldn't afford to be away for long.
The absence of a knight posed a threat elsewhere. At the time, Aspen was the most pressing issue, so the knight had no choice but to come. Otherwise, the knight wouldn't have even participated in the battle. It all made sense. Everything added up. The absence of knights, why only part of the knight order remained at the royal palace. And all of this was a perfect opportunity for those with ambition who dreamed of rebellion.
Even the royal guard has become embroiled in factions.
The gatekeepers and their captain were no different. Everyone was in a position where they had no choice but to pick a side. Reality and facts intertwined to tell a single story. Why did everything seem to fall into place so perfectly? Why was the stage set so conveniently for those dreaming of rebellion? Why did the circumstances make it so easy for them to act? Enkrid's instincts sharpened his already excellent sense of judgment. Even though he wasn't in battle, his focus heightened naturally, and his senses became keen. His mind raced, and he drew one conclusion. What does Krang stand to gain from all of this? Why did he come to the royal palace and cause all this commotion? Since his arrival, the noble faction had been acting like their feet were on fire. They were pushing the crown heir to demand the throne. He had already gathered some influence. Everyone knew that Marcus from Center Pole had sided with him. Impatience leads to action. The noble faction acted that way. Looking deeper, the nobles could even be signaling which side they were on through their actions. In this situation, you either choose a side or you're pushed out. You had to make it clear where you stood.
Am I right?
There was no need for a long question, Enkrid asked, and Krang, with a bright smile, answered. That smile looked so innocent. It didn't seem like the face of someone with such intricate schemes. To some, that smile would have been terrifying.
I was just about to tell you everything anyway.
He had no intention of hiding his motives. No, in fact, it seemed like he was telling Enkrid to notice them. Krang dusted off his knees and stood up. As he got up, he kicked the stone he had dislodged earlier. With a loud clink, the stone flew off into a shadowed area where the light couldn't reach.
I'm going to gather up all the useless things and sweep them away. That's why we need a civil war.
If you gather up trash, you either burn it or bury it. A civil war is the act of doing that. That's how he had set it all up. Of course, the premise was that they had to quietly push the noble faction out of the royal palace first. Krang wasn't here to prevent civil war. He was here to accelerate it. No, his goal was to fully achieve his own objectives through the process. In other words, by laying the groundwork and subtly forcing people to take sides. He intended to separate what could be said from what couldn't be said. And of course, the foundation of that would be power.
He deliberately pulled troops from the palace to filter out potential traitors.
That's the conclusion. Enkrid stood up as well. It was time to leave. He could see Andrew coming out of the mansion, looking utterly exhausted. As he watched, Enkrid asked a question, one of the two reasons he had come here.
Do you know who the leader of the Black Blade is?
The leader of the bandit group had a position within the royal palace, and that person was a member of the Black Lily. That's all Jackson had been able to uncover. However, he couldn't figure out just how well the leader was hiding their identity. In the meantime, a request had come from someone suspected to be part of the Assassin's Guild.
It's just a coincidence, but we share the same goal. That person is my biggest headache right now. I'll sort out the information and send it to you so you can think it over. I'm also trying to track them down.
Enkrid nodded. He had essentially accomplished the purpose of chasing Krang down through various parties. His curiosity had been satisfied, and he had secured a promise of assistance. At this moment, Enkrid had effectively chosen his side.
Oh, Enki, you don't plan on becoming my knight, do you?
Krang stopped as he was leaving and asked suddenly.
What?
I didn't think you'd be satisfied being anyone's knight. Just saying.
He flashed that same innocent smile as before and then turned away, leaving. His attitude made it clear that the answer didn't matter. Enkrid didn't think too deeply about it either. He had always weighed the idea of becoming a knight, but he had never considered being anyone's knight specifically. It wasn't an important question right now. What mattered was that Krang was distinguishing between friend and foe. He had set the stage. Through his actions, he had spoken to all the nobles, revealing his intentions. Of course, only a select few among the nobles would grasp his hidden intentions, but even if they did, they couldn't ignore it. Krang had essentially told all the nobles, there are no knights, no knight order, so feel free to run wild in the palace. The effect was clear. Everyone was gathering their private soldiers, plotting or scheming for a coup against the royal family. Count Molson had proclaimed himself the king of the frontier, and within the royal palace, the number of those openly displaying their ambitions had increased.
Is he going to get himself killed at this rate?
Enkrid briefly worried. In this precariously laid-out situation, Krang was the one in the most danger. Naturally, the appearance of someone with a claim to the throne would be a thorn in everyone's side. Given the circumstances, to think that he would calmly foresee a future where he becomes king, it was a testament to his capacity. Enkrid dismissed his fleeting concern. A mind as sharp as Krang's would have surely considered how to protect his own life. After all, This was a game built on the foundation of power. Enkrid was curious, though. What hidden power did Krang possess? The urge to witness it suddenly welled up inside him, though it seemed Krang wasn't going to reveal it anytime soon.
Please stop attending these sane.
Andrew, who had approached without Enkrid noticing, grumbled.
Isn't training better?
Andrew fell silent at that statement. If he had to choose between a party and training, what would it be?
I'll go with training,
He said it while briefly sweating from his forehead.
but I will keep moving forward.
In any case, the days of chasing after parties were over. Even after bringing Jackson along and keeping an eye on the surroundings, no one else dared to challenge them. Things would remain quiet until the spark Krang had thrown exploded. In the meantime, they would capture the leader of the Black Blade, interrogate them, and observe the chaos Krang was about to unleash, perhaps even lend a hand. That was all there was to it. In doing so, they might end up fighting an unexpected opponent. Would these ambitious factions really attack without thinking? Speeches without force behind them tend to lose power, especially now when the royal palace's law was dictated by strength. The chief constable was said to be particularly threatening.
Off to go.
With determination and a tight clench of his jaw, Andrew spoke, and Enkrid followed suit. They returned to the mansion, and the next morning, Enkrid was greeted by a visitor.
As the rumors said, you really have come to the capital.
Kin Vizar, a woman known as the most beautiful in the capital, and Enkrid was drenched in sweat, swinging a halberd. Rem had emphasized that experience with various weapons was just as important as sparring against opponents. It had indeed been helpful. With one hand on the end of the halberd, he was recklessly swinging it, causing sweat to pour down. So when he received his guest in that state,
Your manners in receiving guests haven't changed, I see.
You didn't come alone, did you?
Enkrid asked, lowering the halberd so the tip pointed toward the ground, then turned to face her. His thin training clothes clung to his body from the sweat. This made his muscles stand out. Kin, briefly wanting to run her hand over them, opened her mouth to speak.
No, there's someone who wishes to see you. Wouldn't you prefer to clean up and greet them properly?
From outside the mansion, Enkrid could feel an imposing presence. In other words, someone formidable was here. While they weren't exuding a deadly aura, they weren't hiding their presence either. To assert oneself so confidently, what did that mean? At the very least, it meant they were a knight.
No need to get all dressed up to meet an old man,
Someone said as they entered the mansion. It was an elderly noble with white hair. Though he was nearly at an advanced age, his steps exuded subtle strength. It gave the impression of a firm, solid stride. As he entered, Mac hurried out, and Andrew also stepped forward.
But what brings you all the way here?
Even Andrew seemed uncomfortable. The one closest to the queen in the current kingdom was Vizar. The one with the most formidable power, aside from the Knight Order, was Count Molson. But if all the citizens and nobles were asked to name the most noble figure, it would be a different name. There was someone who, in their own lands, was respected for their kindness and clarity of governance, and who, even without aligning with any faction, was respected by all. Naturally, he was one of the 5 great noble families, owned the largest land in the kingdom, and had been the queen's mentor. He was the Marquis of Octo, the kingdom's 4th finger. He looked like a friendly old man who was obsessed with chess. The smiling Marquis entered and said,
I've come as a guest, but if I'm in the wrong place, do let me know. I have no intention of being a bother.
At those words, Andrew shook his head.
But not at all, though it's a humble place. You are welcome to stay as long as you'd like.
The fact that even Andrew, who was usually indifferent, showed such respect was a testament to the Marquis's reputation. Enkrid, too, felt a similar sentiment. This man was different from the other nobles. He was someone who had built much based on his own estate. Among all the nobles Enkrid had met here, this one gave off the purest impression. But that didn't mean he was to be underestimated. The aura of the guards standing behind him made that clear. Sitting on a stone bench off to the side of the training grounds, the Marquis observed Enkrid with a sharp gaze, further reinforcing that fact.
Go on with what you were doing. I came by suddenly, so I'll wait.
Your Excellency the Marquis.
Kin spoke from the side, gesturing with her eyes for Enkrid to come and sit down. Enkrid, noticing this, spoke.
All right then.
Since the Marquis's offer to wait wasn't just a formality, it seemed right to respect that. It wasn't a battle of wills. Yet, with Enkrid's choice, The tension from the guards behind the marquee grew just a little sharper. Enkrid found that interesting. It seemed like the two guards would pounce at the slightest provocation.
Who's here?
Of course, there was a reaction from behind Enkrid as well. Rem spoke, stepping forward, while Ragna, seated nearby, cast a glance in their direction. Jackson had somehow already positioned himself, leaning against the mansion's outer wall, while Dunbachel and Esther stepped up next to Enkrid. Judging by their presence alone, these were people who wouldn't be outmatched by anyone.
Keep doing what you're doing.
The Marquis spoke as he sat down, with two bodyguards standing like statues behind him. The tense atmosphere only lasted a moment. The two bodyguards neither smiled nor showed any signs of displeasure. They were indifferent, as if simply doing what they had to. Ragna thought their posture was quite good. It wasn't too rigid, nor did it exude arrogance. They likely knew how to exert just the right amount of force when necessary. Ragna saw that in them. While Ragna observed their posture, Rem read the atmosphere. The tension wasn't because they were unpleasant, but because they were in a dangerous place. That's how it appeared. Thus, Rem figured there was no need to fight the bodyguards. The next focus was the Marquis. He looked like an old man with nothing to do.
Isn't there anything to keep him busy?
He didn't speak it aloud. Since they had come to see Enkrid, it wasn't his place to step forward. Rem couldn't help but find it amusing that he didn't have to step in.
Is this how it's supposed to be?
Did it feel awkward all of a sudden? No, not really. It just seemed so natural that his mind found it strange. Respect Enkrid because he's their leader. Rem realized that he was now following Enkrid without even noticing. But it didn't bother him. It happened so naturally before he even became aware of it. Esther sensed the aura of magic from the others, but concluded that there was no actual wizard present.
Artifact.
The wizard's desire and curiosity started to rise, but she quickly suppressed it. If she acted on her own, it would cause trouble for Enkrid. Right beside her, Enkrid forcefully thrust his axe spear into the ground. He continued his training, paying no heed to the Marquis's words.
Balancing your body is fine, but it's no good if the force of your strikes is lacking, is it?
Rem stepped back and offered advice. The axe hanging at his waist swayed, tapping against his thigh. One of the bodyguards glanced at him, but since they were merely exchanging looks, it wasn't enough to escalate into a standoff. Rem's attention was entirely on Enkrid.
Well, your foot.
He indicated for him to shift more weight onto his left foot. Wouldn't that make him lean forward too much?
What happened to your heart of great strength?
Though it wasn't said aloud, that would be Rem's response if Enkrid were to question him. In just that brief conversation, Enkrid had a small realization.
If you have strength beyond your limits, you can also attack using that power.
Strength beyond limits, immense power. To think that only he could use such power would be arrogant. He had to assume that his opponent could also do the same. What Rem was teaching was a technique called Giant Slayer. Despite its name, it was actually a technique for dealing with weapons wielded by those with giant-level strength. It was Rem's original technique and training method, one that he had recently developed. He was turning his unique experiences into techniques. Hadn't Enkrid already shown him firsthand? The trapping sword technique was a joy to watch. Rem did the same. He laid down his experience as a foundation and concretized what he gained from it. Then he systematized the results he had solidified into steps and sequences so that they would become second nature. Experimenting through Enkrid was sufficient. Rem also learned while teaching and refined his methods. Enkrid knew what Rem was doing. He could feel once again that this stubborn friend of his was a genius. But that didn't change anything. It was just an observation. Since learning and mastering new things was fun, whether this guy was a genius or not didn't matter. So, as always, he learned with sincerity and dedication, training and repeating. Rem simply enjoyed watching him do so.
Stronger. Do as I said.
Rem spoke, and Enkrid moved his body according to his words. To withstand a giant's attack, you must understand what they are capable of. Strength beyond normal limits is called great strength. What can one with such power do? The Marquis was simply amazed at the seriousness of the person training before him. Jackson watched the Marquis quietly. No killing intent, no aura, no presence, he just observed. Jackson figured that the leader of the Black Blade Bandits was likely one of the nobles.
But surely not someone of the Marquis of Octo's rank.
If he were of that level, The leader of the Black Blade Bandits would have already made a move, wouldn't he? Aside from Count Molson, this was the most powerful figure in and around the royal court. This was already known because they had investigated the power struggles within the court.
It's not him.
The Marquis had the kind of grace that only comes from a man born and raised as a noble. He could not be the leader of the Black Blade Bandits. The head of the Black Blade had come to the court as the leader of a group of thieves. It was unlikely he'd been able to discard all his past habits. As Jackson observed the Marquis, one of the bodyguards looked at him. Despite giving off no detectable presence, he noticed Jackson's gaze. The bodyguard must have his own means. Not the same as Jackson's, but something. After all, a man of his caliber would need someone skilled enough to avoid assassination attempts. Everyone maintaining a position in the capital was facing the threat of assassination in one way or another.
Is it willpower?
He hadn't learned any sensory techniques, nor did he emit the same aura, yet he caught Jackson's gaze. It had to be willpower. There were ways Jackson could conceal himself even more, but it was unnecessary at the moment. Jackson withdrew his gaze. Though the tension hadn't escalated to a confrontation, a subtle sense of unease hung in the air as the Marquis spoke.
Won't you at least offer me a cup of tea, Baron Gardner?
What? Oh yes, moving course.
Andrew, sweating nervously, quickly ordered the tea and refreshments to be prepared. There were only a handful of servants in the mansion. One maid approached, trembling as she recognized the Marquis of Octo. To the young maid, the great noble before her was not like Andrew. Andrew could also harm her if he were to become displeased, but he was her master, whom she saw every day. She had grown accustomed to Andrew and knew he wasn't that kind of person, but the man sitting before her now was a great noble. Literally, with just a gesture or a single word, he could destroy her life and that of her family. The fact that his rank was higher than Andrew's meant her master could not protect her from him. Though she didn't fully understand this, her instincts filled her with fear. The maid, trembling uncontrollably, eventually spilled the tea. The tea, which should have been poured into the cup, dripped over the side. The flowing tea ran across the table and dripped onto the Marquis' lap. The Marquis stood up calmly and moved to the chair beside him. The maid, unable to say a word, turned pale and began to tremble violently before finally kneeling.
Forgive me.
Enkrid had just finished his training.
Your hands weren't steady,
The Marquis said. Mac brought a handkerchief to help the trembling maid, but the bodyguard was quicker. The bodyguard immediately took a clean handkerchief from his coat and wiped the Marquis' knee. Enkrid's gaze shifted to the Marquis. The Marquis, without paying any mind to being watched, spoke.
Baron Gardner.
Yes.
You should pay more attention to the maid's training.
Yes.
Mac cleared the table in the meantime, while the maid continued to tremble. Andrew sent her inside. The maid walked back into the mansion on shaky legs, managing to keep her balance and not collapse. After Andrew personally poured the tea, the Marquis nodded in acknowledgement. He neither displayed kindness nor reprimanded harshly. The Marquis took a sip from his cup, and Kin Visor sat silently beside him.
May I also have a cup?
Kin asked.
Would you mind?
The Marquis of Octo chimed in. There was no reason to refuse.
Of course.
Andrew nodded. In the meantime, Enkrid walked over and sat down across from the table. The small disturbance was over. Enkrid neither showed excessive politeness, nor was he rude. He simply sat down, maintaining a neutral demeanor. The Marquis observed this, while lifting his teacup to his lips. The steam from the tea wafted up as he took a sip.
What do you think would have happened if I had consoled the maid earlier?
The Marquis asked, still holding his cup, a smile on his lips, though his eyes did not share the sentiment. Enkrid found it difficult to discern what kind of person the Marquis was. He had met many people, but this man was not easy to figure out. If Krang was like a blazing sun, the Marquis was like a flowing river. You could never tell where the current would go or how it would change.
There would have been two outcomes. Either she would feel relieved or anxious.
Enkrid casually wiped the sweat from his arm and placed his hand on the table.
Oh, why would she feel anxious?
She might think you consoled her outwardly, but would harm her later.
Are you saying that maid sees the world in such a negative light?
Or, if she told someone about the incident later, they might say, "You spilled the tea, but instead of being angry, he comforted you? Be careful with him." Something like that.
Enkrid, imagining the maid's older sister saying those words, mimicked the conversation in a poor imitation. But the meaning was clear. There are plenty of old nobles who pretend to be kind in public while secretly exploiting their maids. So, it's better to show a bit of displeasure than to pretend to be overly comforting. Once this incident passes, the maid will actually feel relieved. She'll think she's paid the price for her mistake. The Marquis hadn't gotten angry, but had scolded her lightly for being unsteady, and that was that.
You're quite thoughtful.
I often hear that I'm not very noble-like.
Is that so?
Kin Vizar almost spat out her tea at the Marquis's comment. Instead, she gripped her teacup tightly. A man known as a noble among nobles saying such things? It was almost a play on words. Can someone who flies into a rage over a maid's mistake really be called noble?
Why have you come here?
Why do you ask?
For Kin Vizar, hearing such a direct question from the Marquis made her heart race. Her gaze naturally shifted to Enkrid.
I want to know what kind of person you are. Can you answer?
How would respond? Kin knew how Enkrid had ended up here. She could also roughly guess why. He could say he was here to support someone's rightful path to the throne, or he could say he came because he had been hired for a job. If he said he was just here to lend a hand because it looked interesting, Kin would nod in agreement.
He might actually say that.
Knowing Enkrid, it wouldn't be surprising, but would the Marquise be pleased with that answer? Probably not. The Marquis's gaze held neither expectation nor amusement. It was neutral, yet the weight of it could still be felt. Enkrid opened his mouth.
I am here for a world where no child has to appear on the battlefield.
At that unexpected answer, everyone, including Kin, fell silent. Enkrid continued reciting his words with the calm cadence of poetry. It was a quiet, unshaken declaration, a pledge, a statement of will.
I am here to reduce the monsters and beasts. I came to protect those who know how to care for their own. I came to punish those who oppress others with their power. I am here because I want to protect the dreams of those who still have them, and to shield the weak.
Empty words, hollow words, spoken off the cuff. No, they had meaning. Words filled with conviction, sincerity, spoken not from the lips but from the heart. For a moment everyone, Kin, the Marquis, the bodyguards, even Rem, Dunbachel, and Andrew, felt as if they had been swept into the whirlwind that was Enkrid. Words in and of themselves hold no power. Anyone can speak. But words also carry power. Because these words carried intent, they carried conviction. When no one else spoke, the Marquis set down his teacup with a quiet clink and spoke.
Did you say your dream is to be a knight?
It wasn't as though Enkrid's dream had spread far and wide, so it seemed the Marquis had sharp ears. Enkrid nodded.
Yes.
I'll support that.
Yes.
The Marquis stood up. Why had he come here? Surely, it wasn't just to confirm that Enkrid's dream was to become a knight. Yet he was standing up now? Kin was confused, but as a woman who had charmed men for years, she maintained her composure. The Marquis, having stood, ended the conversation shorter than expected and turned to leave. As he began to walk away with brisk steps, he stopped before taking 5 steps and turned back.
Oh, but isn't it odd for someone who claims to protect the weak and dreams of being a knight to just stand by while people die in the capital? There are incidents every night, you know. Or do you only act when you've been given a commission?
The Marquis' tone and movements were awkward, as if it had just occurred to him, but in truth it was a calculated statement. He intentionally made it obvious. You're saying you don't act on your so-called knightly convictions or your ideals unless someone like Krona hires you or pays you. Enkrid could almost hear the subtext of the Marquis's words loud and clear. It was an unfair accusation. The matters in the capital fell under the jurisdiction of the city guard. Enkrid was part of the border guard reserve unit, so if he intervened, it would actually put him in a position to be reprimanded, should he entertain this unreasonable challenge. Enkrid looked into the Marquis's eyes. A faint smile appeared in those eyes.
Ah.
It was a provocation. Absolutely a provocation. Enkrid could feel it clearly. Can you do it? You don't have to. You know it's not something you're required to do. But does it align with your knightly code? So what's your dream again? A knight? Can I light? Or are you just avoiding this because you think you can't handle it? The Marquis's unspoken words swept through Enkrid's mind in an instant. Though the Marquis hadn't actually said a single word, Enkrid heard them all. He was a noble draped in dignity, so he wouldn't actually say such things aloud, but Enkrid felt as if he'd heard it all. He had no choice but to take the bait. This was about proving himself. To put sincerity behind his words, actions had to follow. If it's all talk, no one will follow. No one will stand behind him.
I'll start looking into it tonight and resolve it.
Much appreciated.
Their eyes met and the Marquis smiled. The corners of his eyes softened. Enkrid returned the smile. His hair had more white than black, and his beard was short. His body was moderately trained, but had passed its prime. There was a bit of hidden flab left. It wasn't the kind of body trained with full dedication. There was an air of nobility about him, even while he was still. It seemed as if he was saying, "This is what it means to be a noble." This is how Enkrid perceived him, both in appearance and aura. So when he mulled over what the man had said, a thought occurred to him.
Marquis, indeed.
Enkrid calmly acknowledged that he had fallen for the provocation, but it wasn't a big deal since nothing would change because of it. Above all, he had been planning to act on it from the start. In fact, he was almost grateful the Marquis had said just the right thing. Even so, there was no need to act immediately. His sweat had cooled enough for the breeze to feel chilly. Enkrid set down the halberd he had been holding to one side. He placed the rest of his weapons, one by one, in the armory next to the training grounds, careful not to let any dew form on them. At that moment, all thoughts aside, he was hungry. He had trained, dealt with the Marquis, and now hunger was gnawing at him. It was time for lunch.
Let's eat.
Enkrid spoke as he closed the armory door. Kin lifted her head at that. Perhaps she was hoping for an invitation to join them for the meal. No one extended one. No one even glanced her way.
Are these people blind?
She was starting to feel a dip in confidence about her appearance. Therefore, she had no desire to linger any longer.
I'll be going.
Kin left, accompanied by 5 guards waiting outside. Each of them stood in immaculate posture. They seemed fairly skilled. Enkrid glanced at them and thought to himself, dragging an entourage around like that. Well, with the recent rumors about the capital's security being a disaster, it was probably necessary. The Marquis had brought unusually few guards with him earlier. Once Kin had turned away, Enkrid started walking back into the mansion and spoke.
Weren't you interested?
Andrew was right next to him. Enkrid had seen Andrew glancing a few times toward Kin as he let her leave, so he asked.
But I'm busy trying to save my family. I don't have time to be distracted.
Enkrid nodded as if to say, "Fair enough. There was no right or wrong in life. Where would you even find such a thing? It was all just one's own choices." Enkrid respected Andrew's decision.
You're still unique, Captain.
Andrew said, but Enkrid had heard this enough times that he let it go in one ear and out the other. It was a better remark than being told to visit a shrine for treatment.
I was hungry too.
Dunbachel approached from behind, speaking as she did. Enkrid firmly told Dunbachel that if she didn't wash up, there would be no meal for her. Naturally, she washed up as well. After a while, everyone gathered at the dining table, and the meal was served. The maid who had made a mistake earlier had composed herself by now and was diligently bringing food and drinks to the table. Soon, a hearty meal filled the table. Today's menu consisted of carrots, broccoli, potatoes, and beef stew cooked with wine. It was one of the traditional dishes of Naurilia. Monsters and beasts had generally driven humans to live in castles, and as a result, food culture had flourished. The technology to build fortresses had also advanced rapidly for similar reasons. Thus, the culinary culture within the castle had developed in various ways, and no wonder, for this was the capital city of Naurilia. Even the chef Andrew had hired would be considered top class outside the capital. Slurp. Enkrid tasted the stew first. A rich, savory flavor enveloped his tongue and slid down his throat. The taste awakened the hunger he had temporarily forgotten after washing up. He picked up his fork and placed the diced beef and carrots onto his plate, taking a bite. After setting aside the bay leaves, he pierced the meat and brought it to his mouth. With a single bite, the well-cooked beef offered a soft texture and practically melted apart. It was tender and fluffy, breaking down in the mouth. The beef's richness harmonized with the umami, flowing down his throat like a waterfall. The carrots were soft, and the broccoli, having absorbed the seasoning, had transformed into something new. It was a satisfying meal. His hand handling the fork started to move faster. Everyone else was eating much like Enkrid. Even Esther had taken a human form and joined at the table.
It's always fascinating to see.
Andrew remarked as he watched Esther. Since the 5 apprentices and Mac were dining separately, the only people at the table aside from Andrew were Enkrid's people. Esther noticed where Andrew's gaze was and spoke.
Is this your first time seeing a witch?
Esther asked, which was uncharacteristic of her. It was a gesture of goodwill, offered because a proper meal had been served. Of course, it didn't really seem like goodwill to anyone else, but to Esther it was.
This is the first time's a beautiful sorceress.
Esther didn't particularly react to the comment. Andrew hadn't meant anything by it. He just thought it was natural that Enkrid wouldn't be swayed by Kinvaisar. Esther cut her broccoli with a knife and popped it into her mouth. Her beauty was almost otherworldly. Her long, flowing hair, blue eyes, and mysterious aura made her seem like an untouchable presence. Yet, everyone around her treated her casually. Rem asked a question, and Esther nodded.
Does food taste better when you eat as a panther or as a human?
Dunbachel asked as well.
Why don't you transform and find out for yourself?
Esther answered without expression. She wasn't angry, this was just how she was. Andrew, having spent several days observing her, had finally started to get used to it.
That panther was a witch?
But what surprised him even more was Enkrid. Compared to when he had served under him, Enkrid had become a completely different person.
Is he really going to become a knight?
The thought crossed his mind. Andrew dismissed his idle thoughts and focused on his meal. Watching the others eat, it became clear that if he didn't start soon, he might not even get to see the meat. Even though they had prepared plenty, this was how it always turned out. These people ate about 3 times as much as a normal person. Everyone seemed to have forgotten about the incident with the Marquise. Andrew found that remarkable as well. No one asked or questioned what had happened. It was the difference between following someone and trusting them. As he watched Enkrid, Andrew subconsciously realized what he needed to earn from his subordinates. It was an unexpected revelation. Andrew was lost in thought when, after everyone had filled their stomachs, Dunbachel asked with her mouth still smeared with sauce.
What do you think it is? And for the record, it's not a beast folk.
Even though she skipped over a lot of context, everyone understood. He was referring to whatever it was that had been prowling the streets of the capital at night, kidnapping people. Whether it was an assassin or a monster, they first needed to know what it was before they could hunt it down. Rem agreed with that sentiment. They had to figure out what their prey was before they could track it.
A beast prowling at night.
Even if the capital's security was in shambles, it didn't make sense for a monster to be running wild, which meant it was something that hid during the day and only acted at night, and only once every few days. Even with this information, it was hard to deduce its identity. Ragna also nodded slightly, indicating that he understood and shared the same curiosity. Enkrid found it surprising that no one was questioning why they had to be the ones to hunt it down. The fact that even Dunbachel asked what it was without any complaints was impressive. It was fascinating how they followed without any grumbling. In truth, they were all a bit bored. Harassing trainees and sightseeing in the capital could only entertain them for so long. Rem had already started sharpening the edge of his axe, which was a signal that he was eager to fight. The atmosphere in the capital was also intense, similar to the feeling on a battlefield. After chewing and swallowing what was in his mouth, Enkrid finally spoke.
A wizard who controlled lightning, a cave, and alchemist's experimental subjects.
It was a string of words. Enkrid had an excellent memory. He had also heard about the events that had taken place in the capital. Andrew had even helped organize the information for him. The sound of a beast howling at night, causing people to disappear every few days. A presence that couldn't be felt during the day. When Enkrid pieced all the information together, something came to mind. His mouth opened again.
And Black Blade.
Jackson was also present at that gathering, where everything Enkrid had just said had come together. It was the place where they overturned the location, where the Black Blade bandits had been producing drugs, revealing clear evidence of human experimentation. Was it the alchemist named Laban? There was a madman with that name. There they also saw a human, half turned into a ghoul, lying sprawled out. Enkrid organized the information, recalling the events and piecing them together. What kind of creature runs rampant at night and hides during the day? What could it be related to? How would the current situation tie into this? The leader of the Black Blade Bandits is in the capital. He has lost the sword called Lycanos, and those he would call enemies have come close to him. No, they haven't just come close. They are already here.
Does Jackson not know he's being hunted?
Of course he knows. If he didn't, he wouldn't have been able to hide his identity and pull off these schemes for so long.
Is that correct?
Jackson furrowed his brow and asked. Enkrid nodded. He didn't stop there and continued explaining for the benefit of those who followed without question. The traces are close to that of a monster, but the fact that it hides during the day is proof that this being has reason. If it didn't, it would mean someone is controlling it and releasing it at specific times. But that's not feasible. The capital's security forces aren't completely incompetent. They couldn't pull off something like this without getting caught. Enkrid recalled the head of the guard he had seen when entering the capital. The man with the feathered hat had left a strong impression. Regardless of his skills, he didn't seem like someone to be easily fooled. The fact that they hadn't caught this creature meant that its strength and movements were difficult to deal with. Enkrid rested his right elbow on the table and raised his index finger as he spoke.
The conclusion is a human undergoing a monster transformation.
What kind of thought process does it take to arrive at such a conclusion? Even Esther only understood after hearing it explained. When Enkrid contemplates swordsmanship, he considers everything from start to finish. His exceptional memory aids him in this. He also adds a creative and flexible mindset. Creativity and flexibility aren't just innate, they require constant training and repetition. For Enkrid, swordsmanship and physical techniques were always like a cliff, with no clear path forward. He had to constantly think and strategize to climb that cliff, otherwise there would be no progress. This is what allowed him to expand his thoughts. Because anything was possible, he could consider all possibilities. When he gathered all the information, he arrived at the answer.
It only appears when the moon is up.
Jackson added to the conversation. Jackson had taken an interest in all the strange happenings in the capital. Naturally, who knew where a clue might surface? However, this particular case had caught Jackson off guard. To be honest, he had forgotten about it. There were so many mad alchemists performing human experiments in this world, after all. But now that he was piecing things together, it made perfect sense. If the human was undergoing a monster transformation, then what kind of monster was it? It only appeared on nights when the moon was out, and it couldn't resist its instincts in the dark.
Lycanthrope.
If Jackson had deduced it, then his captain surely had too. But there was no need to say it out loud. He kept his mouth shut.
Now there's only one thing we need.
Enkrid continued. Rem, who had been quietly listening, nodded and spoke.
We don't have the authority. Exactly. If we investigate the scene of the incident starting tomorrow, the constables will be overjoyed to see us. They'll jump at the chance to challenge us, asking who gave us the right to act. And we can't just knock them down every time they get in our way.
Rem responded, and Enkrid nodded. Rem wasn't a fool. Sometimes his troublemaking was just that, trouble for its own sake, but other times it was calculated.
Troublemaker either way.
Enkrid thought to himself, organizing his thoughts. If the Marquis hadn't just been making empty promises, he would send them something useful. If Enkrid had the ability to handle this, where would the authority come from? Who could grant it? A noble's permission would make things easier. All they needed was a shield strong enough to fend off the constables. Enkrid thought this far and spoke. If Marcus or Kreis had been there, they would have stood up and applauded.
You should go into politics.
Marcus would have said in advance,
You're using that gift of gab to steal women's hearts. A woman's heart is fickle by nature, so thinking everything through like that is a talent.
Kreis would have said something along those lines. They had quite different ways of looking at things. Of course, since neither of them were here, there was no one to admire Enkrid's words. Rem just wanted to swing his axe around for a while. Ragna felt similarly. Dunbachel was no different. Esther had no intention of casting any spells either. However, she was interested in the idea of experimental subjects, a fusion of human and monster. That's what they call a chimera. She had no intention of dabbling in such things. It was entirely separate from her world of spells. It wasn't necessary, and the thought disgusted her. For a sorceress, feelings are important. If something repulses you, it means it's not in harmony with you. If you continue doing something that repulses you, you'll eventually lose control over your own spell world, and in the end, lose your magic. Esther had made a similar mistake in the past, which is why she stepped away from this situation.
I'm going to rest. This cushion suits me.
Do as you please.
Losing Esther wouldn't change anything. Enkrid raised his second finger on the hand resting on the table.
Second conclusion. Since it's a moonless night, all we need to do is sleep well.
Andrew, who had been watching from the side, at some point couldn't keep his mouth closed, staring in shock. Then he shut his mouth at Enkrid's words and asked,
How are you so smart?
Haven't we had plenty of time to think?
By that, did he mean anyone could have figured it out? Is it really just a matter of having enough time?
So, you're saying the constables and guards in the capital are all idiots?
Andrew muttered in disbelief, but everyone let it slide. After all, that was mostly true. No, it was more that Enkrid was exceptionally brilliant, but no one reacted to it.
Why is no one surprised?
Only Andrew mumbled, but soon even he closed his mouth. This was just the kind of man Enkrid was, and this was the kind of unit they were. That night, Enkrid and his crew slept soundly. As usual, Enkrid woke up at dawn and began practicing the isolation technique. Andrew joined a bit later. It was a morning like any other, nothing out of the ordinary. Amid their morning training, an unfamiliar voice rang out.
Was it really you?
A guest had arrived. More accurately, it was a gift from an organization. He had requested proper authority to handle matters. They sent Asia, a squire of the Red Cape Knights, and naturally she recognized Enkrid. Enkrid had one more reason for coming to the capital.
Could I face off against the masked knights?
It wasn't just the threats from monsters and beasts that advanced the city's culinary and construction techniques. Those with outstanding martial prowess also gathered within the city walls. It was a necessity for survival and defense. Among those who gathered, the foremost were the knights, and the knights of the capital were the symbol of military power. When dividing ranks into city level, national level, or continental level, where did it all begin? Where did the term junior knight come from? Everything was based on the existence of the knight orders, and it was one of these orders. The Marquis had investigated Enkrid. He had a rough idea of the man's preferences. What mattered most to Enkrid more than women, rank, or power? By digging into his past, by understanding the path he had walked, and the purpose that drove him, one could know a man. The Marquis did just that.
I hear I am to be the gift. What does that even mean?
Asia entered the mansion and spoke, and behind her Enkrid could see the Marquis smiling. Standing on one side of the training ground, Asia was lightly armed, with a sword strapped to her side.
The sly one.
Andrew had once said that he was a man who had swallowed dozens of snakes, with the intestines of a hydra. It was an apt description. A man whose true intentions could not be known. Was he on the Queen's side, Krang's side, Count Molson's side, or Viscount Myrna's side, or perhaps he was positioning himself as a new power? No one knew. He was merely in the capital as the Marquis of Octo. Given the power he wielded, he couldn't be taken lightly, and even the Queen treated him with caution. A high-ranking noble she couldn't recklessly offend. Currently, there was no Grand Duke in the kingdom, and no one held a title higher than a duke, so alongside the Marquis of Vizar, he shared control over the nation's power. Would such a Marquis side with Krang? The emergence of a Grand Duke, something that hadn't happened before, would also affect his power. It was said that for this reason, the Marquis of Vizar didn't welcome Krang either. Marcus had said so himself. Yet, despite the fact that everyone could see that Enkrid was on Krang's side, the Marquis had approached him, struck up a conversation, and even asked for his assistance in certain matters. A man whose thoughts and actions were utterly unpredictable. Well, for now, all of that didn't matter.
You don't need to worry about that.
Enkrid was pleased. He had wanted to meet her, and there she was, one of the people he was eager to charm into sparring with him.
Speak casually.
Asia nodded as she spoke. She was the same as before, with a gentle face and short hair. She brushed back her orange hair with her hand and stared intently at Enkrid. It was shocking and absurd. To her, the fact that this man stood before her didn't make sense. She clearly remembered when she had conducted a sort of skill test for Enkrid at Marcus's request in the border guard. She vividly recalled the sight of Enkrid passing out under pressure.
Luagern had said he was a bit different, though.
Asia trusted her own instincts more. It was only natural for her to trust her own experience more than the words of others. After all, she was someone who had to walk her path with conviction, as someone aspiring to become a knight. In her eyes, it would have been a miracle if Enkrid had reached the level of a squire. No, that was a very generous assessment. At the time she had observed him, she judged that he had no potential to advance further, but here he was, the same man, standing before her, earning fame in various ways and meeting her gaze boldly.
How did you do it? What kind of tricks did you pull to accomplish such feats?
A feeling similar to competitive spirit was rising within her. She wanted to gauge his skills. Although she had come here for business, the moment she saw him, she knew. She hadn't joined the Knight Order and risen to the rank of squire for no reason. Wielding a sword or any weapon suited to oneself, becoming obsessed with body techniques, combat and fighting. That's what it took to become a squire. Only when talent is combined with ambition can one reach the rank of squire. As he looked into Asia's eyes, Enkrid paused what he was doing and met her gaze.
Do it again.
He had told her to speak casually, so she did. Her straightforward attitude appealed to her.
What?
She asked back.
Your intimidation, you'll just foam at the mouth. Do it.
This time there was nothing felt from behind him. Back then, when she had used her intimidation, hadn't his subordinates been glaring at her? Andrew Gardner was nothing to worry about. What concerned her were the men under this guy she had seen before, but again, they were nowhere in sight. Asia summoned her intimidation. She shifted her stance, turning her body sideways and mimicking the gesture of placing her hand on the hilt of her sword. Intimidation was a technique based on willpower, used to break the opponent's will.
Kneel or die.
Enkrid felt the murderous intent in her intimidation. An imaginary blade flew toward him. He knew it wasn't real. The old Enkrid, who once closed his eyes at the sight of a sword, or the one who was crushed by intimidation, no longer existed. A will of refusal surged within him, pushing back against her intimidation. Enkrid took a step toward Asia. Her pupils widened. She had heard the rumors, but only after seeing it for herself did she believe. This guy was the real deal. Lua Gurn had been right. Her judgment, based on experience, had been wrong. Unlike before, when he had forcibly endured it, this time he countered her intimidation with sheer will.
Sparring?
Enkrid asked.
Sounds good.
Asia replied energetically. The slender, straight rapier at her waist was drawn. Holding her sword vertically in front of her face, Asia spoke.
You didn't think intimidation was my only specialty, did you? If you're not a fan of losing, you'd better take this seriously.
Enkrid responded. It was a subtle provocation. Asia smiled broadly. The expression on her face seemed to say, I need to teach this guy a lesson. Enkrid, from that shift in her expression, quite satisfying. As she raised her sword, Enkrid adjusted his sword belt and fine-tuned his grip for a narrower draw. At the same time, he shifted his left foot and let his arms hang naturally. He was in the ready stance just before a fight, sparring as soon as they met. How unexpected. Work and everything else didn't matter right now. None of that was important. Asia started off seriously from the beginning. There was no need to test each other cautiously. They were both squires after all, possessing that level of combat prowess. Just the fact that Enkrid had overcome her intimidation was proof enough.
I don't know how many wills you're using, but get ready. It's going to be fun.
Asia said as she lowered her vertically raised sword, pointing it at him. Enkrid instinctively measured the distance. 5 steps. With her sword drawn and aimed forward, it felt like the tip of her blade was right in front of him. Enkrid shifted sideways, changing his position to stand with the sun at his back. Asia didn't move her feet, using her left foot as a pivot, and only adjusted the direction of her sword. The tip of her blade still hovered before Enkrid's eyes. At first, Enkrid looked at Asia. Then his gaze shifted to the center of her body, focusing on her shoulder. The focus point skill activated automatically. This was a true squire of the Knight Order. Just because he had once faced a knight's sword didn't mean he could overwhelm her. With the heart of the beast, he held on to his boldness. With focus point, he locked his eyes on his opponent. He heightened his senses and prepared himself. He was ready to strike at any moment, full of thoughts of launching the first attack. However, as Enkrid stared at her shoulder, his field of vision gradually narrowed. The broad view of her entire body shrank, narrowing to her shoulder and hand. then to the rapier and the hand gripping it. Eventually he could only see the blade of the rapier. As time passed, his gaze became even more focused, honing in on the very tip of the blade. Finally, all he could see was a single point. But that point grew so large that it completely blocked his view. He understood it logically. His opponent was simply holding a sword and pointing it at him. But
I can't get a sense of the distance.
it was clearly 5 steps, yet the distance vanished. All he could see was the tip of the sword, which had become a dot. There was nothing but the dot. There was no intimidation, no pressure. Naturally, the will of refusal didn't activate. All he saw was the tip of her sword. Enkrid couldn't even begin to search for an opening. How could he, when all he saw was the dot? The more he focused, the larger the dot grew.
What the hell are you doing?
Andrew, watching from the sidelines, was bewildered. They had gone on about trying something, then took a step forward, proposed a sparring match, drew their swords, and now they were frozen. Enkrid had taken a few steps to find his position and measure the distance, but now both of them were standing still.
Aren't they going to fight?
Andrew had been excited to witness a high-level sparring match, but time had already passed with no action.
Should I say something?
Leave them alone.
Just as he was thinking that, Rem approached from behind and rested an arm on Andrew's shoulder. Andrew's body froze as Rem's hand gripped his shoulder and neck.
If you interfere now, that blade might fly right at you.
Rem pulled him back as he spoke, and Andrew quietly followed his lead. It wasn't just Rem who had arrived. Ragnar, Jackson, and Dunbachel had come out as well. All 3 had their eyes fixed on the center of the training ground. Sweat began to drip down Enkrid's forehead. Asia, too, was not entirely calm. Her opponent's energy was fierce and intense. Even the slightest opening and it would erupt like a volcano. If that happened, it would be difficult to maintain her current advantage. Leonice's divided swordsmanship into 5 categories: precise, illusory, heavy, swift, and graceful. He organized their strengths and weaknesses into a cycle of mutual countering. A correct sword technique was weak against an illusory sword technique. A correct sword technique trapped the opponent within the user's intention, so it was weak against an illusory sword technique that deceived and misled the opponent. The illusory sword technique was weak against a heavy sword technique. Because the illusory sword relies on deception, it was vulnerable to straightforward attacks. A single heavy strike was the strength of the heavy sword technique. However, the heavy sword technique could be countered by the fluid sword technique. Because it was straightforward, the heavy sword was prone to being misdirected by flowing movements. On the other hand, the fluid sword technique struggled against the swift sword technique. The sheer speed of a swift sword, striking before the fluid technique could redirect, rendered flowing movements ineffective. Lastly, the swift sword technique was vulnerable to the correct sword technique. Once trapped within the anticipated movements of the correct sword, the power of speed was diminished, making it easy to counter. The correct sword was weak against the illusory sword. The illusory sword was weak against the heavy sword. The heavy sword was weak against the fluid sword. The fluid sword was weak against the swift sword. The swift sword was weak against the correct sword. Of course, just because you used a swift sword didn't guarantee you could beat a correct sword, and there was no certainty that a correct sword would always lose to an illusory sword. Everything depended on the level of training, so the outcomes of battles were never straightforward. One could even die while fighting an opponent much weaker than oneself. It was an old saying, "The sword has no eyes." Whoever is struck by a blind sword will die. Death is fair to everyone. Humans strove to overcome that fairness by surpassing their limits. That was willpower. The embodiment of willpower was the knight. Asia's sword was an illusory sword technique. It was a technique that used the opponent's focus against them, countering their moves. As soon as Rem, Jackson, and Ragnar saw Asia's technique, each of them instantly thought of ways to counter it. They were geniuses, after all. Of course they would. But if they faced Asia directly, she would also adapt, so the outcome of the fight would be uncertain until they actually clashed. Dunbachel couldn't immediately grasp her technique, but she knew what she could do.
Strike before she draws.
Enkrid couldn't immediately understand Asia's technique either. But the path he had walked, the skills he had honed, were his own. Whether it was a dot or a line, it didn't matter. If he couldn't break through it, he would destroy it here. The moment he realized time wasn't on his side, Enkrid moved. The sound of his sword being drawn was unusual. It was so fast and straight that it made that sound. It was a swift draw, minimizing friction. This was the result of relentless training. It was the will of the moment. The sword he drew was ember. Ember became a streak of white light, slashing through the dot. The sound of metal clashing echoed. As soon as something touched the tip of Asia's sword, her muscles contracted and exploded with force. Her sword flew back at twice the speed, slashing at Enkrid's neck. It seemed as though blood would immediately gush out with a splat, but it didn't happen. Enkrid barely avoided it, tilting his neck back just in time. Asia stopped at that moment. Any further, and this would have been a fight to the death. For a first sparring match, this was already brutal. It was hard to even call it a sparring match. Even in the Knight Order, sparring with real swords like this would draw angry complaints. They'd ask,
"Are you trying to kill each other?"
And yet,
One more round.
Enkrid's eyes sparkled. A faint smile appeared on his face. He looked absolutely thrilled. Hadn't he just narrowly escaped death? And yet he was smiling like that? No matter how daring one might be, no matter how much they loved a good fight, when you come that close to death, some negative emotion is bound to surface. But Enkrid showed no trace of resentment, complaint, or dissatisfaction. Not even a speck of negativity.
What?
For Asia, this was a first. She had never encountered a person like this before.
If you're tired, we can take a break.
Even those watching from behind reacted to his words.
He's at it again.
He's crazy.
It was Rem, Ragna, and Jackson, in that order. Dunbachel kept her mouth shut. She wasn't confident that she could block the sword technique Asia had just shown. It wasn't the speed that was frightening. If it were just about speed, Enkrid's sword was even fiercer, so. It wasn't the quickness that surprised her. It was more about the way Asia stole the timing.
My breath was interrupted.
She knew this because she had been unconsciously engrossed as she watched. Asia's sword slipped in between breaths where it was impossible to avoid. If it had been her, her neck would have been cut. Of course, she wouldn't have fought the way Enkrid did if her opponent was holding their sword like that in the first place. She would have run. She would have created some distance and started over.
Could I win like that?
It would be difficult. Dunbachel found the thought frustrating, and she let out a sharp breath through her nose.
You're kind of a strange person.
Asia finally said to Enkrid.
You're smiling right now, too.
Enkrid replied. He was right. Asia, too, was feeling rare excitement and joy. It had been years since she had experienced something this fun.
Haven't you had breakfast? I haven't eaten anything.
Asia said.
Andrew.
Enkrid called out to the owner of the mansion. Andrew nodded. Since they always made sure to eat regularly, breakfast was surely well prepared.